Welcome to the Accumulating Wealth Podcast. I'm Judson Crawford, a CPA, wealth advisor, and partner at Kane Waters and Associates, a financial services firm here to help business owners navigate the decisions they face every day. Our new Orthodontic Practice Comparison Report launched last week with lots of insights on production, collections, staffing, fees, and more. And while the data is great, what we really want to talk about today is what it means for your practice. Now, Hunter is off in Vermont at a sourdough starter convention, cultivating his yeast. So I brought on a special guest today to help us dive into the report and identify actionable items to help your practice grow in 2026. So let's go see what we got. Okay, so back again for our Orthodontic Practice Comparison Report. We've got Scott Lyle. Scott, welcome again to the podcast.
Thanks for having me. Happy to be here.
So how many years now have you been here? I mean, we've got to be talking, are we going on 10? Right at 10?
Just hit 9, going on 10.
Just hit 9.
Yep.
Okay. Well, Scott, for those of you who have been involved with my team before, obviously if you're Scott's client, you know him. Scott was on my team before. So many of you are familiar with Scott, and he's joined us the last couple of years to talk about the Ortho report. So Scott, before we jump into the report and go through some of the data on each page, you've been through these numbers a ton. What would you say is like your biggest takeaway or biggest surprise once you saw these numbers?
I think for me, it's the level of production growth year over year. It was obviously a tough year in a lot of places, but seeing growth up over 8% from last year was a little bit surprising to us when we started digging into the data and kind of mining everything.
Yeah, I tend to agree with you. And I think we've said this really about 2024 and 2025 now is, we just didn't know where it was going to land. Because like you said, it's not like when we have all of our clients in the office that just everybody is having given growth, right? It's kind of been tough slogging in a lot of areas. It's just not something we're experiencing across the board. But growth came in really strong at 8.26%. What's interesting, we were talking about this and we were checking the numbers, and it makes sense because when we look back and we look at these things year over year over year, and when we look back, what we saw is that in our report, production last year was 3.9. And then we can look at that and say, in an ortho practice, our production usually rolls over into collections the next year. And sure enough, our collections in 2025 were 3.9. So, that adds up. And so we're looking at apples to apples here. But here's an interesting thing for you, Scott, is, okay, so we've got production. It's up 8.26%. And we're going to go through more in detail in the report, but I'm going to throw some numbers out here at you. What goes into that production? So I look back and I go, okay, well, starts were up 3.5%.
Yep.
Okay. And then I go back and I go to fees, and fees maybe were up 2 to 2.5%. So there's maybe 5 to 5.5%, but we're up almost 3 percentage points higher than that. And at first I was like, okay, that doesn't totally add up to me. Like how can production be up more than our starts and our fee increases? And we talked about it and tell the listeners, and I agree with you, but tell their listeners what we think the reason is.
Yeah, I think one of the big focuses in a lot of practices over the last, 12 or 18 months is ways to increase the value of every start. And so kind of some of the ancillary services, one of the more popular ones recently is a retainer assurance program. It goes by a million different names, but that's one of those things that when you layer it in, it increases your production on the same number of starts or relatively the same number of starts that you would have had previously. So I think kind of our thoughts as we dug into it is just that makes sense with how creative practices are trying to be to increase the value of every patient in the chair of adding in, whitening or a retainer program or whatever the case may be to give extra oomph to that production.
Yep. Yeah, and I think it makes total sense, and I think that is something that over the last couple of years that we've seen is, kind of these add-ons to your basic orthodontic fee that have actually been really additive to a lot of practices.
Yeah, absolutely.
Right? Something that you guys need to look into if you're not doing. Okay, so We had a great year. Collections made a lot of sense based on last year. Production was up quite a bit to almost $4.2 million on average. Um, let's talk a little bit about, that's great on the top line. Let's talk a little bit about what we saw as far as the overhead in our ortho practices and changes from last year. What are some of your takeaways?
Yeah, salaries were relatively steady overall. Marketing was down ever so slightly, and then lab was also down a touch. So I know a lot of folks on the lab side, especially, are looking at ways to mitigate those costs. Especially aligner costs have been getting really high over the course of time. So we see, and we'll see this a little bit with the production mix as well. Our lab costs were down a touch. Our supply costs were up a little bit. So we're kind of seeing a change in that mix of what's hitting our expense line items.
Yeah, and I think the biggest decrease, I mean, when you look at not single line items, when you look at it as a whole, what really went down is the percentage of fixed cost.
Yeah.
Right. And so I think that, for all of our clients that come in and we look at your financials time and time again, probably the biggest reason for that is just growth in the top line.
Yeah.
Right. Fixed costs stay fixed. As you grow your top line, your fixed cost percentage goes down. That's natural, as you see your top line increasing. So, but a good increase overall in net income. We saw almost a 2% increase in our average net income from our ortho practices. So again, half of that being in a decrease in fixed cost, maybe a 0.5% in the lab and a few other little areas as well to get to a 2% decrease there. So by the way, just to wrap that up, and I don't know if you said this, net income for our ortho practices on average, 42.66%, so almost 43%. And for those of you that haven't listened to this before or are not Cane Waters clients, when we talk about what is in that net income, that does not include any doctor salary or any perks like pension or automobile or things like that. And then is before any interest payments or any debt payments as well. So really what you're looking at is the operating costs of doing an ortho practice outside of paying a doctor and the perks that go to the owner.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay. So if you guys download this book, what we have talked about so far is really encompassed on kind of the summary page. And so for the rest of the podcast, we're just going to kind of walk through a few of the other things that we see on some of the other pages. You guys can walk along with this, and obviously here at the end of the episode, we will tell you where you can get this if you haven't downloaded it yet. But if you are an ortho out there, it's a great thing to go through with us. So Scott, what page is next in our ortho report?
We've already kind of hit on it, but we're going into production and collection, so digging in a little bit more there. Obviously, the big hitter, so to speak, being the overall production being up 8.25% is huge. And you saw that collections were up as well based on the production increase in 24.
Yep. And one thing that I want to point out here, and I know that this is, again, and we've often had this. If you're not a client or you're a client that, you're like, gosh, these numbers are way higher than me. We understand that. We also have line items in here that talk about practices of different sizes. But one line item in here that I often talk to clients about is the production by provider number. Back in the day, it used to be a little bit below 2 million. It's approaching 2.5 million production by orthodontists in our practices. The reason that I use this a lot is that in a lot of practices, this is kind of the number that I use to say, okay, if you are at or above this level as a single practice doctor, or you have two doctors and you're at or above this level per doctor, this is, I think, when you can start thinking about, how am I, do I enjoy producing this much? Is this a good pace at which I'm working? Or is this the time in which I'm starting to think about that potentially associate, bringing in another doctor, growth, all that kind of stuff? I just think it's a really good number for us to keep in mind, especially as advisors.
Absolutely.
All right, where are we going next?
New patients.
The lifeblood.
The lifeblood of the practice. So overall, I think the couple big takeaways here on this page. First off, similar to the calculation we did on kind of the increase in production, is we saw that our conversion ratio was up about 0.5%, and our new patient exams were up about 1.3%. But our starts were actually up closer to 3.5% overall. And I think that kind of points out, we talk about it a lot, of managing the obs pool appropriately. So when you do have years where these new patients are a little bit harder to come by for various reasons, having that healthy observation pool and having it managed appropriately so that you can draw on it in your practice helps keep things moving forward the way you want them to be.
Yeah, and we've always taken the really simple approach to conversion percentage. We literally just look at starts to new patient exams, right? I know a lot of people take certain things out, add certain things in. To be consistent with our clients, we just do the really simple way to do it, and we've really been hanging in there around 70% now for a handful of years, and I think that's a really important number because when I look at my ortho practices, increasing your conversion percentage is often a way that you can affect your production the most by a small adjustment.
Absolutely.
2 to 5% can make a huge difference in your total production. So if you're not at that 70%, that's something that should be addressed quickly. What did you see with the aligners this year, Scott?
Yeah, so it's interesting. Aligners were down 7% as a percentage of overall starts. That I expected it to be down a touch. I know a lot of folks are trying to do different things again to save on costs. And to save on just treatment timeline, working out with patient compliance, et cetera. But it being down 7% was a little bit surprising when we were digging into the data.
Agree. And again, there's probably a million reasons for that. It's not necessarily something that I would have guessed it being down that much either. I've got to think that overall cost structure probably has a play in it. Again, kind of just guessing there.
I've also heard that kids' braces are cool again, so maybe that's part of it too. People don't want aligners these days as much.
Everything comes in waves, right? The kids want their colored brackets again.
Right.
Okay. The last thing on this page, and I think it's worth talking about, that it was a little bit of a surprise to both of us, was that we saw that marketing costs were down a little bit. And a number that we like to talk about as advisors a lot, the new patient acquisition cost, was actually down, right?
Yeah, it dropped a few bucks, $5 or $6 per new patient, from about 119 to 113 year over year. To your point, that wasn't exactly the direction we thought it would head. I think the takeaway there, especially as new patients are harder and harder to come by, is not losing focus on driving new patients into your practice. I think some of it, and we're kind of talking big picture here, of bringing more social media marketing in. I think folks are moving away from as much paid digital marketing and trying to bring things back in-house, which is probably part of where this data set is coming from, as a way to be cost effective, but have the patients driven into the practice.
Yeah, you also brought up a good point that, if there are practices, and you said that you've had a few that have done this, if there are practices that are kind of going back towards having that marketing coordinator or having some sort of paid staff doing more marketing, that often does not fall into our advertising costs, right? That's right. In salaries.
And I think it's interesting that our salaries number didn't go up, because logically, if we're moving a $5 or $6 a new patient on 1,054 new patients on average outside of our marketing category, the fact that salary stayed relatively steady, I think, is a really good sign that we're being efficient with where those dollars are going as a whole.
Yep.
As well.
And we're all for costs going down. I just think the main thing that our advisors are telling our clients is, hey, even if you can get it done more efficiently, don't take your eye off the ball of marketing, because, again, it comes back to getting those new patients in the door. And I think that as we've seen a tightening in the economy, you are fighting over a smaller new patient population.
Absolutely.
Right? And so you've got to stay ahead on the marketing game.
And one other thing I'd add there, especially for those practices that are in growth mode, this is an average. So there is, generally speaking, as long as you feel like you've got good ROI there, no issue at all with spending more than $115, $120 a patient. You have to spend more to grow, generally speaking.
Yep. Yeah, the next area of the report, which I think is probably something we don't need to spend a ton of time on, but I also think is one of the most useful areas of the report for our clients, is the payroll, right? We break this down by position in an ortho practice and show you what the average hourly was in 2025. Can give you a good idea where your staff are. This is a great thing to use to assess where you're at, to assess what raises could be needed. What do we see overall as far as increases, Scott?
I think one of the big things that jumped out at us is the last few years we've had some wild swings in certain categories. So marketing in 2024 was an example where it was up, 11.5, 12%. Everything was pretty steady in the, flat to 4% up range, which kind of leads us to the thought of, okay, we've got a little bit more consistency. I know there was more attrition in staffs, at least anecdotally with the doctors I work with all the time, from 23 to 24 than from last year to this year. I think that's a huge thing. The other thing that did jump out, we talk about when we're recruiting associate doctors, which is a big topic a lot of the times when those practices are at $2.5 million a provider. It's a little bit harder to get docs out in a rural area. We see that in the average associate daily rate. So from last year to this year, we saw the overall average increase by about $30 a day from 1530 to 1560. But we saw the rural associates being paid a lot more, going up from about 1535 to 1608, which makes a ton of sense. Generally speaking, those are younger doctors. Generally speaking, those younger doctors want to live in a more urban or suburban area.
Yeah, and it's interesting too, because some of these categories of staff, not every practice has, right? But if you look at the categories that every one of our ortho practices have, which is basically assistant, front desk, and probably financial insurance coordinator, every single one of those is up in the mid to high threes, essentially, right? As far as growth goes. So I think that you can take that as saying that, hey, that 3 to 4% range is probably the best average as to what we're seeing kind of the trajectory go. Okay, now, as advisors, one of our favorite topics, and as orthodontists, one of your least favorite topics is fees, because you don't like to increase them as much as we say. And here we are, another year where you didn't increase them as much as we like to say. No, sort of kidding. Obviously this is one that's sensitive to a lot of people. And I think we had seen some larger years in 23 and 24 with all of the inflation. With some of that inflation flattening out, I'm not really surprised to see where we're at. But Scott, give us a kind of an update on where we're at as far as fees go.
Yeah, fees definitely overall increased by a lower rate than they have in prior years. So from 23 to 24, we were up on average about 4 and change percent. This year, we were up on average just about 2, give or take. One of the things that jumped out at us, and I think this has been a conversation in a lot of practices, is your phase one fees have historically been pretty low in a lot of places. And so there was a concerted effort to bring those fees up. So in prior years, we've seen that phase one fee increasing at a higher clip than your general overall fees. We saw that kind of come back down into normal, so to speak, which kind of tells us it seems like we've reached parity there overall, and we're now increasing everything at, generally speaking, the same rate year over year.
Yep. And again, we harp on this a lot, and it's hard for you guys, or it feels sometimes hard for you guys, but we're going to keep pushing you that fees do need to go up every year. Your suppliers are charging you more. Your staff is going to need to be, have increases. And this is how you control, this is how you control what comes home to you as well, right? To make sure that every year you're not diminishing what you're taking home. I think that overall, one of the tricks, and we talk about this a lot too, and it's even here on our report, and this is something that we have found younger doctors need to check into more. As Scott said, we've seen over the years that phase one has really come into line where these used to be really undercharged. But one of the things I love for our younger clients or newer clients to check out is, their combo phase one and phase two compared to their full treatment cost. We've consistently been in the 140 to 150% range if you combine those two. Now, I know that you're probably giving discounts on some of that when people start phase two, but as far as full fees go, make sure that you're in that 140 to 150% range of your full treatment fee. Okay. Next, we've got the contracts receivables page. If you move on to that, I don't think that there's anything that's super important about contracts receivable other than it's kind of staying around that 60% of production mark. We would expect that to grow as we see production grow. But there were a couple other things on this page, Scott, that were probably of key importance other than just the number of contracts receivable.
Yeah, absolutely. I think one of the biggest things that practices are dealing with and really that patients are thinking about is, what's my cash flow to start this treatment for myself or my kid or whatever that looks like. And so again, for the third year in a row, we saw a dip in the average initial payment. Now, this does include paid in full cases as well, but the average initial payment was about $750. That was down 8% from last year. Further illustration of we're trying to be creative with getting these starts in. We're trying to be as flexible with financing as we can be. And at the same time, when I have this conversation with doctors, one of the concerns is, okay, well, if I start letting my treatment payments go further out past expected completion timeline, I have an issue with potential delinquencies and folks stopping to pay me. So one of the things that we tracked is from last year to this year, we actually saw that patient delinquency was down by about 13%. So we're seeing that with practices that are being really diligent. It's one of the things I talk to doctors about of when you're going and allowing patients to stretch out that payment timeline, making sure that you really have your internal processes locked up so that you don't start to have a delinquency problem. It's going to happen, but anything you can do to get in front of it, and we've seen that practices have been pretty diligent and pretty good about making that happen.
Yeah, and we've been talking about this for years now that just the flexibility for the new patient to get the start going is key, and I think we're just seeing this as a continuation of that. So no surprise there, but it was a bigger jump than we've seen in years past. Okay, so I think big takeaways, Scott. If we really to kind of loop back and summarize some of those things, I mean, some of the things I heard were, keep focusing on marketing because we got to keep those new patients. Keep focusing on observation because that really clearly helped prop up our production this last year. What else?
Keep focusing on the other ways to increase your production. So making every start more valuable with whatever you can add in that provides value both for the practice and, let's be honest, for the patient as well. And really one of the things I would add in on that is focusing on the messaging to the patient when you're explaining why a retainer program is good for them as well.
Yeah. Awesome. Well, thanks for coming on, Scott. Again, if you want to download the Ortho report, you can do so at canewaters.com/ortho. It's easy to do and something that you absolutely should do because it's super valuable in all of your practices. If you have any questions about the detail on any of these numbers, if you want all of the data behind these numbers, email Mason at canewaters.com. He's always willing to dive into all of the numbers for you. Or if you have any PPP loan questions, he's there for that too. The best way to keep up with this is to subscribe to this podcast. That way you never have to miss an episode and you can go back and listen to all the others. If you're enjoying us so far, leave us a review. Have a question, comment, or a crazy social media video for our next FinTalk episode, drop us a line at canewaters.com/wealth. We really do answer these. And if you want to learn more about what we're doing when we're not recording these episodes, visit canewaters.com to see how we're helping our over 3,500 clients reach their long-term financial goals.